Hey everybody, it's Kelly. Welcome back to another episode of Ask a Therapist. This week we're talking about moral injury. This is a phrase that gets used a lot when it comes to veterans. This phrase in general is fairly new when applied to the LGBTQIA community. That does not mean it doesn't apply. As a whole, moral injury is defined as the psychological, social, and spiritual impact of events involving betrayal or transgressions of someone's deeply held moral beliefs and values. In some instances, some people would tack on to that definition in high-stakes situations. And I wouldn't disagree. For most people, average life on a daily basis isn't necessarily a high-stakes situation. A couple of years ago, I published a video that is essentially the video that put this channel out there for most people. It was about heteronormativity. And in that video, I addressed minority stress. And I haven't talked a lot about it since then, but minority stress is the stressor for any minority in a society. And that stress is an everyday living kind of thing. It's living every day as any type of not majority within the society. So if the society is set up not for you, that would involve every day in minority stress. So for instance, when you are watching TV and all of the couples that you see are man, woman, heterosexual, cisgender, if you're not seeing yourself reflected in media, you're not seeing yourself reflected in any way, in anything that you're seeing. If you're not understanding yourself to be, in general acceptable to society, the ways that that impacts you on a regular basis is going to apply minority stress to your life. And that's minority as in not minor stress, but minority as in being a minority, like a sexual minority, a identity minority, however that gets phrased depending on how you identify. If you are not cis het, that does put you in that situation. If you're part of the LGBTQIA community, you experience minority stress on a regular basis. Because of that, in general, day-to-day living anywhere except for in your house completely by yourself would be a higher stakes situation than it is for someone who is cis het living out in the world. Another definition for moral injury is sustained and enduring negative emotion, guilt, shame, anger, which is the result of betrayal, of violation of boundaries, or suppression of a deeply held belief or moral. Well, I don't necessarily like to label certain emotions as negative or positive because I do think that all emotions have their place. I don't necessarily dislike that definition either. Overall, the impact of moral injury on the queer community is just recently really being looked at. And the reason that I bring it up in this video and why I think this is an important video to be talking about during Pride Month is because this goes beyond heteronormativity. This goes beyond heterosexism. This is more than the internalized homophobia piece that we've been talking about for so long. This is that sort of deeper impact that having to hide who you are, having to potentially lie to people that you meet, depending on who you are and what circumstance you live under, the long-term impact of that it has on you and what that looks like for your future or your present. So to break this down a little bit better, there are generally 3 things that cause moral injury, and they would be an act of commission, an act of omission, or a betrayal. So an act of commission would be something that you do. And that could be anything that you are engaging in that puts you as an active part of the queer community, especially if you grew up in a religious household, if you grew up in a not queer-friendly town or family. If you grew up hearing that it was wrong or any other derogatory thing about being gay, being trans, being anything that's not cis het, if you grew up believing any of that was wrong for any period of time, when you discover yourself to be part of that group, at some points, any action that you have, dating, talking to, watching movies, anything that brings you as an active part of that community is going to feel like an act of commission. That internal struggle that you have during that is potentially causing you some moral injury. Doesn't mean you're doing something that's immoral. Obviously not. The lessons that you've gotten your whole life, that there's something wrong with that, then struggles against your knowledge that there's actually nothing wrong with what you're doing and that what you're doing is just fine for you to do. And if not just fine, actually great for you to do because it's something that feels actually very natural for you, possibly for the first time, right? So this piece of you that's like, wow, this is great. I feel like me for the first time. And that voice inside of you that's saying, what am I doing? I've always been told this was wrong. That conflict, that cognitive dissonance, if you will, the longer that goes on and the longer you either shove one down and listen to the other one without resolving that piece, the deeper that moral injury goes for you. And the longer you ignore that, the longer it's going to impact you. Acts of omission. These are things that you don't do, things that you don't talk about, maybe lies. When you meet someone, if you leave out the gender of the person that you're dating in order to make sure that you're not causing problems or going to have an argument with someone or going to have to explain something to someone, that is an omission, right? That costs you something. Anytime that you have to hide part of who you are, whether it's intentional, whether it's unintentional, whether it's just for safety's sake. Maybe you're in a place in your life where you can't be honest about who you are to everybody, or maybe you're aware of how unsafe it is to be honest with everybody about who you are. Wherever you fall on that spectrum, anytime that you have to hide pieces of who you are, anytime you have to walk into a room and sort of scan to see who might be a threat to you, depending on where they might possibly stand on an opinion on how much right you have to be yourself, that causes moral injury because you know that you have a right to be yourself. It might be buried deep down in there somewhere, depending on sort of the life that you've lived, but you know you have a right to be yourself. And to have to justify that to people is not okay. And inherently, we know that's wrong. We know we shouldn't have to justify ourselves to people, but also we find ourselves having to justify ourselves to people, or we find ourselves hiding parts of ourselves so we don't have to justify ourselves to people, which we also know to be wrong. Again, that conflict causes moral injury. And the more time that we spend in those kind of arenas, the deeper that injury goes and the longer it takes for us to sort of heal that part of us, which is also why not having community where we can be ourselves can be so problematic for people. And it can be so hard sometimes, even when you find that community, to trust it because you have these layers of problematic interaction with people where it has not been safe, or maybe you thought it was safe and it actually wasn't, or whatever your experience was. When you live in a town, in a state, in a country, in a world where it very well might not be safe for you to be just who you are to everybody, that very lack of safety that people who are cishet do not understand not having, that very lack of safety causes you moral injury. Period. End of sentence. And then you've got betrayal. And I wish that I could say differently, but I'm not sure that anybody who's part of the queer community hasn't experienced betrayal on some level. There's a lot of layers to that, but in reality, who hasn't told someone who they are and had them tell other people their own information, right? Like when it's not their business to go tell people and they tell people anyway because they don't understand that that's not appropriate, right? Or who hasn't trusted somebody who's broken that trust in a way that then puts you in potential danger depending on who finds out the information. We, again, live in a world that our information about ourselves can be used in certain ways that doesn't always make us safe. I wish in 2024 I was able to make a different statement. But here we are. The complicated part of this is not knowing who to trust also causes that moral injury. And then trusting the wrong person and being betrayed causes moral injury. So what are you to do? Who are you to trust? And how do you handle that? And the longer you go in that confusion, the longer you go in either not trusting or dealing with that betrayal and not having anywhere to talk about that to, the moral injury gets deeper. Another huge layer here is the religious community. And that's sort of where this entire channel lands, right? The queer community and the religious community and the intersection of the two. The moral injury that exists in queer people who grow up in religious communities is deep and lasting because you're told for a very long time there's something wrong with you. You're told that if you pray hard enough, if you work hard enough, if you do enough good things for God, that you'll be relieved of this this thing that is clearly wrong and that God never intended for you. And the longer you sort of dive into that and believe that and work in that and work against who you actually are, the harder it is to sort of come out of that without some really deep and intense ramifications to your psyche, right? And there's not a whole lot of studies and there's not a whole lot of knowledge, to be completely honest. There's not a whole lot of training in the therapy world for people to recognize things like religious trauma, especially religious trauma to people who are queer. And there's a lot of different options for solutions for that. But right now we're kind of in the midst of this wild, wild west of people treating religious trauma within the therapeutic community. The morals that you grow up with in the church, the way they prescribe morals to you and morality to you, would make you think that living into who you are would be immoral. And it's not. But the understanding that you will lose fellowship with people and you will lose the love and care that you have from these people who supposedly want the best for you if you live into who you know yourself to be is a threat that is intense and scary and really can upend your entire life. So you get to choose you and who you know yourself to be, or love and acceptance from the people who supposedly love and accept you. That choice is not one that anybody should ever have to make, ever. And it's one that especially people within the LGBTQIA plus community have to make all the time. And nobody has like an instruction book for that. And nobody explains what to do after that. So here we are, right? In the midst of all of this moral injury impacting our community. And what do we do with that then? First is to recognize it. That's the purpose of this video, right? Is to help you to recognize it. This goes deeper than heteronormativity. This goes deeper than internalized homophobia. This is to the core of who we are, and that wrestling of understanding who you get to be and how you get to live into that, and how the messages you've gotten from the world as a whole have brought this conflict on you, and how you sort of deal with that. Sometimes this stuff sort of comes up for us with anxiety. Sometimes it manifests itself in depression. It can come up for you all sorts of different ways, and at different times in your life it might look different. Mindfulness as a whole actually does help to sort of like ground you in the moment, and to give you like, this moment here is the one that I'm focused on, not the messages from my past or the worry about the future. Like, give me this moment, like, let me just live in this moment here. And I know mindfulness for a lot of people just feels like a woo-woo answer, and I get that. I completely do, because it doesn't fix anything, but sometimes that's where you have to start, is just like getting your feet solid in where you are at the moment. Finding a community of people that also understand and have dealt with similar things. And I know for a lot of people, they have found such a community on this channel. In the comments in a lot of these videos, you can see people who have been able to relate to each other. I know there have been some friendships that have formed sort of offline also, that people have just been able to find comfort in one another in similar stories and in similar circumstances. Those are always options. There are online groups out there if you know people in your like hometown where you are right now. There is not in reality an actual shortage of people who have experienced this in their lives. It's finding them that can sometimes be the problem. If anybody has found a way to find that type of community, if you've found something online that you want to share, go ahead and share that in the comments below. That would be amazing. If any of you has like a Discord server or anything that you've started, any way that you want to help other people to find this community together, feel free to share that in the comments below. I would also encourage you to find a peer support group, find a therapist. There are lots of ways to work through this, and it does not have to impact you for your whole entire life. But a lot of this does need to be worked through in a step-by-step sort of a progression, and not all of it can always be worked through by ourselves. I also realize that therapy is not accessible to everybody. I do have a video I'd recommend checking out if therapy is not accessible to you right now, and that is, do I need a therapist to heal from religious trauma? It's not specific to moral injury, but it's right around the same principle. So go ahead and check that video out next, and that's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. I will see you all next time, and until then, take care of yourselves and each other.